Ladies and gentlemen, please continue eating your dessert and coffee if it's in front of you. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to introduce the 14th Dean of the Academic Board, Brigadier General Cindy R. Jebb. A member of the West Point class of 1982, General Jebb commissioned into military intelligence and served in the 1st Armored Division with 3 Corps and at the National Security Agency. Here at West Point, General Jebb served as a faculty member in the Department of Social Sciences, where she taught courses in comparative politics, international security, cultural anthropology, terrorism and counterterrorism, and officership. She has authored or co-authored 3 books, conducted human security research in Africa, completed study projects in Iraq and Afghanistan, and served as a senior advisor to the Chief of the Office of Security Cooperation, Iraq. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations, in 2017, she received an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Bard College. General Jebb served as the professor and head of the Department of Social Sciences before becoming West Point's dean in 2016. As Dean of the Academic Board, General Jebb has spearheaded critical initiatives related to the Academy's schedule and facilities and is a tireless advocate for excellence in our academic program. Her passion for the sport of volleyball is perhaps only exceeded by her passion for USMA's mission to educate, develop, and inspire leaders of character to serve our Army and our country. Thank you, ma'am, for your leadership.
Ambassador Jeffrey, Ambassador Lute, General McCaffrey, General Corelli, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the superintendent, welcome to West Point and Senior Conference, and I want to thank Suzanne Nielsen and Heidi Demarest for all of SOCH, really, for this great conference. And we're all family here, so we all know what it takes to put on a conference. And I can't think of a more timely and important topic. But most of all, it's great to see so many alums here and friends of the department in West Point. And I feel like I grew up in SOCH. In fact, another shout out to those former department heads, current department head that shaped us all. So I do feel like I grew up in SOCH. I mean, many of you, as I look around, were my mentors. Some of you taught me when I was a cadet, mentors when I was on faculty. I know I'm home as I look out and see all your familiar faces. You've truly been an impact on my life and on the life of the many, many cadets who've passed through these hallways. It really is an honor to be here this evening. And I know that this conference will not only be marked by meaningful discussion and conversation, but also another opportunity to reconnect, strengthen bonds, develop more bonds, just a fabulous opportunity. Before I introduce tonight's guest speaker, I wanted to share with you a few thoughts as we think about graduates entering a world that seems increasingly uncertain and complex, probably a very different world that we all entered. And I think it's important that we keep in mind Korishaki's observation, and that is that the Army has been successful, not for having it right, but for getting it right. And that space for getting it right seems to be shrinking. So I wanted to also share with you, and I know I saw Al Wilner here, and Tanya Chacho, who are truly the experts on the China opportunity set and problem set, perhaps. But I wanted to share with you a few things that struck me while I was in China last month. I had an opportunity to visit their 2 academies, 2 universities, as well as you might imagine, visit with the cadets who are studying abroad, which, by the way, you would be so proud of them and how they're navigating language and culture and history and so forth, as well as our Schwartzman scholars and our Yenching scholars. But besides the embedded contradictions that you would imagine you would see as you look around China, what really struck me visiting their academies is that they want to be just like us. You know, I visited 2, each superintendent looked me in the eye. By the way, they were very warm and gracious, and it was the best Chinese food I had ever had. But, you know, they were using the language that we use to describe who we are and what we do. And they were very, very keen on showing me their computer labs, the robotics clubs, the rifle ranges. They had a UAV tracking me as I was going around. And the cadets gave these presentations. They had beautiful English, and they had deep knowledge in their presentations. They had great interpersonal skills. And even when you walked in their gym, you'll appreciate this, it looked just like Arvin, with the track on top. And the message that I got from that was, on the one hand, you could be flattered, because they want to be just like us. But on the other hand, it motivated and inspired me even more about the importance of always moving forward and how important it is that we do posture for the future. And the best way to posture for the future is to invest in people. And I'm reminded what General Milley tells us. You know, his number one priority is readiness. He said, quote, we mortgage our future if we don't prepare for future readiness. And earlier he had noted that, quote, we must continue to adapt and produce the best leader development programs and institutions. And he went on to say, we must create leaders of great competence and of great character. And providing that leader of character is the mission of West Point, to educate, train, and inspire leaders of character. And I know you all know that. And nested within that mission is our academic vision, and that is to educate and inspire leaders of character who think critically, that's part of getting it right, who think critically, internalize their professional identity, and know how to employ their education for the future of the Army and the nation. And with that, we have three outputs. It's the lieutenants, it's that field grade officer who goes back to the Army. We develop the talent for the Army that way, and provide intellectual capital for the Army. We have 26 research centers here at West Point. So if I could share with you our strategic posture statement that my transition team came up with or inspired a summer or two ago. And that is that today's and tomorrow's Army needs a diverse set of officers with an array of talents and perspectives who can think deeply in a discipline, but also imaginatively across disciplines, and are ready to assess into the traditional branches, such as infantry and armor, as well as the newest, cyber. And so, as we think about the academic program, as you think about political science and economics, what does that mean? In some ways, I think, we're graduating a pentathlete effect with each class that we graduate. And so it is very important that we posture for the future. At the academy level, Suzanne mentioned a little bit, I hope you have a chance to visit Davis Barracks, named after Benjamin O. Davis, fourth African-American to graduate from West Point in 1936. He commanded the Tuskegee Airmen. He went on to make 3-star. President Clinton brought him on active duty in the 1990s, promoted him to 4-star, and then retired him again. We have a new, I was just talking to General Ferrari, thank you very much for what you're all doing up at the, with the monies. But we have a new engineering building going up across from Mahan Hall. We have the academic renovation of all, or the renovations of all our academic buildings that will start, and I hope within the next 12 to 14 years we'll be able to see the fruits of that. So it's a very exciting time as you're thinking about education and pedagogy and the spaces that we would like to have for those cadets, to making sure that they're getting prepared as best as possible. A new academy schedule that will allow for flexibility of pedagogy, as well as the ability to manage, to teach, to inculcate the importance of managing unstructured time. We're going to have the IT, this is our most exciting one, IT in the cloud. Yay. And then, and we're on a footing for talent management. And of course, talent management is all about investing in people. And when I think about that imperative, which requires taking time to really know people, to build trust, to powerfully mentor, I think about General McCaffrey. I'm thrilled that we're all gathered here, and I can't think of a better way to kick off this conference than with General McCaffrey as our opening keynote. It is my extreme honor to introduce General McCaffrey, someone who has personally and impactfully mentored me through the years, and I dare say made a positive influence on my life. And I know for many of us in the room, sir, you've done that. A member of the great class in 1964 and a national treasure, General McCaffrey is president of his own consulting firm and serves as national security and terrorism analyst for NBC News. He was commissioned as an infantry officer and served in the United States Army for 32 years, retiring as a 4-star general and the commander of U.S. Southern Command. At retirement, he was the most highly decorated serving general, having been awarded 3 Purple Hearts, wounded in combat 3 times, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 2 Silver Stars for valor. For 5 years after leaving the military, General McCaffrey served as the director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Upon leaving government service, he served at West Point as the Bradley Distinguished Professor of International Security Studies from 2001 to 2005, and as an adjunct professor of International Security Studies from 2006 to 2010. He previously served on the faculty in the Department of Social Sciences from 1973 to 1976. In May of 2010, General McCaffrey was honored as a distinguished graduate by the West Point Association of Graduates. In 2007, he was inducted into the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame at the U.S. Army Infantry Center, Fort Benning, Georgia. And in 2015, he was selected for the Doughboy Award, the highest honor the Chief of Infantry can bestow on any infantryman for outstanding contribution to the United States Army Infantry. I know members and friends of the Department of Social Sciences and the Academy are grateful and honored to hear your thoughts, sir, tonight on the national security for the 21st century. And we look forward to spending time with you over the next few days to hearing your perspectives and thought. Ladies and gentlemen, it's grateful. Absolutely, sir.
Well, I could have hoped for a bit longer of an introduction. One of my sort of standard gags, and it's a true story from Fort Leavenworth, and some of you probably heard this a dozen times. I always tell anybody that introduces me that's the second best introduction I ever got. And then I follow it with a true story of going out to do a combat leadership talk right after I left the Army at Leavenworth. And the custom, as you all know, is some hapless major has to get up and introduce the great woman or man. My son was a student in the course, and they said, "You are introducing your dad." He sniveled, he whined, he tried to get out of it. He called me and I said, "Shut up and do what you're told." So he stumbles on out and he painfully reads through every word in my long bio. And then he ends it by saying, however, he said, "I want you to know that I've worked for this great man for more than 21 years, primarily in the areas of lawn and automotive maintenance." To dispense with any anxiety that some of you may be feeling, there will not be a writ. This is sort of the standard pitch. I try and keep up to date. The numbers are probably largely correct. You know, one of the tricks in government is trying to figure out, trick people into telling you the truth. So this is, sort of background. You may want to leaf through it and use it in any way you feel fit. And by the way, I couldn't talk to a social department, Suzanne, without telling my favorite story about reporting into this department. And Jim Ellis was the exec. First captain, class of 62, brilliant man, deep southern accent. And by the way, up behind his desk, he had the sword from the Department of Mathematics, and he'd been the best math student, plus or minus 3 or 4 years, and he's very proud of that. So he says, "Barry, you're going to teach American government comparative politics, but you're also going to be the sort of the HR guy, the personnel officer. You're going to go out and find shiny captains and get them into Princeton or Stanford and bring them back here." And I said, "Okay." And so I had all the dossiers from the department in my control, maybe 50 officers. And I decided my screening tool would be the graduate record examination scores. And I knew that since we were verbal people, I'd need a very high verbal score, let's say 720. But you'd have to have a lot of quantitative stuff in economics, so I'd need at least a 680 in that. And that was my initial screen. So one day I'm going through the dossiers, and I opened Jim Ellis's, and there it says, graduate record exam, quantitative, 800. Don't see that very often. Verbal, 307. So I walked into Jim and said, "For God's sakes, how'd you end up teaching here?" And he said, "Barry, it's been a problem my entire life. I was the first one that knew the answer, and I couldn't tell nobody." Anyway, Cindy, to you and Suzanne, thanks very much for your leadership academic leadership, scholarly leadership, and your influence on the Army. Pete Corelli, I've seen Pete in combat, I guess a couple of visits, an incredible field soldier, social alumni, Vice Chief Staff of the Army in some difficult days. We were having problems. We needed some wise leadership, and Pete gave it for us. And he's gone on in his second career to make a huge impact dealing with these new signature injuries of our 60,000 killed and wounded, TBI and PTSD and other things. So he and Congressman Pat Kennedy has really made a contribution. How about a round of applause for Pete Corelli? Too many people really talk about in entirety, but here's Dr. Corey Shockey, currently in London, and Stanford professor and scholar, and NSC senior official in the government. And first time I met Corey, I just been made the J5, JCS J5, working with Colin Powell, and I've been there about 2 or 3 weeks, and somebody come in and say, well, the SACIR just called Miss Shockey and told her X, Y, and Z. And the chairman just called Miss Shockey and told her to do such and such. And Miss Shockey, who the hell is Miss Shockey? And summoned her, and it's sort of like a teenage high school senior shows up standing on my rug. And it turned out she was an intelligence collector and knew everything going on in the Pentagon. So the rest of my tenure, she'd report in late in the day, stand on the rug, give me the gossip, and then I'd say, what do we think about this, Corey? Anyway, Corey, you're and then she replaced me brilliantly as the Bradley professor, or distinguished professor up here. Bill Murdy's not here. He's our co-host, done a tremendous amount for West Point. I say co-host because I think he's one of the owners of this beautiful hotel. Jack Jacobs, for God's sakes. My lifelong friend. We both taught up here when we were captains, and we came back again, privileged to come back in civilian faculty. And I think Jack's one of the best teachers the department ever had. I was going by his classroom one day, and there were shrieks of laughter coming out of the classroom. And his EA comes out and said, what's going on? He said, oh, Captain Jacobs, or Miss Jacobs just explained to him, don't worry about getting killed. Everybody's getting killed sooner or later. Very comforting presence in the class. When I was a Bradley professor, I had 3 teaching associates, always picked by the department head and assigned to me. And the first one was Jen Cook Easterly. So Jen walks in, Captain Cook, and I said, oh my God, after I worked with her about a week, that she's twice as smart as I am, much better educated, a tremendous athlete, and meaner than I am by far. You know? So she's gone on to a lifetime of incredibly successful, now Morgan Stanley, and doing tremendous work, and a senior, number 3 person really in the National Security Council in the White House for the last administration. But I always remember her. When we travel, I tell Jen to be in uniform. Right after 9/11, the country was scared. And there'd be a long line of people who wanted to thank Jen for helping defend us. So we're down at National Airport, and she's surrounded by admiring civilians. And I heard a plane get announced, and I said, hey, Jen, is that our plane getting announced? She said, no, it isn't, but you could probably board early under the elderly coefficient. And I'm proud to say I've stayed on as her friend for many years. Tanya Chacho, we had lunch actually with Jen leaving and Tanya coming. I remember standing up and looking at Jen and say, for God's sakes, why aren't you like her? Tanya, I chatted up your mother and your sister out on the porch at Cullum Hall. And the normal stuff I do to every mother, what a great daughter you have and that sort of thing. Her mother starts into by the way, her sister is this very attractive, artsy, New York fashion design kind of person. So mother, sister, Tanya, and I'm saying what a great young woman Tanya is. And the mother said, oh, yes, indeed. No, we've known that. She launches it in the 3rd grade. You should have. And she was working her way through her life. And I turned to Tanya's sister and say, hey, what are you, chopped liver? And she said, yeah, I've been listening to this my entire life. And Tanya's done such distinguished work. Full Colonel Gingy Gilmartin, Stanford PhD, reasonably astute lass, maintained career friendship, seen her in combat a couple, 3 times, tremendous military police officer, visited that modern prison up at Bagram, the most dangerous people on the face of the earth penned in there. And Gingy's boss, I guess, was a reserve full colonel woman JAG officer. And she and Gingy would go in for like these daily conferences with the 30 prisoner leaders to listen to their problems, unarmed in a closed and caged area. Fascinating, the work she's done. Some of the students here, golly, Raven, where are you? I never knew if Raven would end up as a Hollywood star, the governor of California. I just reminded her, spectacular. I think you were the only sophomore in my class in 10 semesters. Sit in the front row and take these notes, and just an extremely talented person. Later on in life, she's trying to get into JSOC. She's going to be a secret agent number 9. And I said, oh, it's a great thing to do. And she goes down and interviews. She calls me and she says, I didn't pass my orals. They didn't think I had adequate explanations of my failures. So I called Eric Carilla, Mr. Rocket Scientist and JSOC operative, and said, hey, Eric, stupid. She never has made an error. That's why she... Just a spectacular officer. Jim Golby, are you here? Nice PhD from Stanford also, one of Jen and my favorite cadets, and Joe Da Silva, and Heidi, for God's sakes. Heidi, where are you? This shiny cadet. I had dinner one night with, we won't mention which commandant, and Heidi tore up the commandant throughout the dinner. Very sharp intellect, very aggressive. The next time I saw her was in Afghanistan, where the Foreign Service officer with 30 years got fired or died or whatever, and Heidi was the POLAD for Afghanistan. Tremendous officer and tremendous friend. I'm very proud of all that you've done. Too many of the, I was actually recruited by Abe Lincoln. Then I reported in, it was Amos Jordan. Then I worked for Don Olvey, and I worked for Russ Howard, and I worked for most of you know Mike Meese, Dan Kaufman, Jim Golden. Just an astonishing history. By the way, Abe Lincoln, the story is, nobody in the room probably met him, right? But I knew him from childhood on up. Dan Lincoln, his son, and I were friends and taught in the department together. Abe was a Rhodes Scholar, forgetful professor, mumbled, nobody could understand what he was saying, an absolutely brilliant officer. He would have gone on to run the Army had he not chosen to come back here to the Department of Social Sciences. And he was so senior that people deferred to him across the country, basically of any rank. So my dad was deputy commander, U.S. Army Vietnam. And he said Abe was sent over by somebody like the president and to look at the situation in Vietnam. And he's going to have dinner with Westy. And Westy was the most disciplined officer we ever had. Looked like a movie star. Went to bed in pressed fatigues. And he had these strict rules on interacting with him. One of them was no smoking. And the other one is 1 drink, and then you sat down for a discussion and you're out of there. So Colonel Lincoln shows up, and he's on his 3rd martini and smoking his pipe with great clouds of smoke wafting up in the air, when the aide passes him a note and says, General Westmoreland doesn't tolerate smoking in his presence. So Colonel Lincoln puts his lit pipe in his aloha shirt pocket and sets himself on fire. I don't know, so many stories about all of you. Dan Kaufman, I made him the man he is today. Honest to God, I was the Department XO and I made him coffee officer. And he contracted with the mafia to take over the the coffee duties. Jim Golden, the only one that's smart enough to talk to Ovi and understand what he actually had said. I don't know, just spectacular people, and I'm glad to see all of you. Hey, let me see, let me not talk about the standard sort of approaches to national security questions. Let me just give you about perhaps 10 quick assertions that may either stimulate your thinking or outrage you, one of the two. But let me start by just saying, particularly with all the active duty people in the room or the ones recently retired, I've spent a lot of time. My son was a professional soldier, my daughter, my dad, my cousins, my wife's dad's a World War II paratrooper. We've been around the military a long time. So sort of a lead-in assertion, this is the most competent, battle-hardened force the country has ever had. Yeah, we got problems, and we could devote a 3-day discussion to those problems. But at the end of the day, and at the last slide I show hostile audiences, going up to the defense conference at Harvard Kennedy School with the PLO guy and the Nigerian oil minister and the conference on Russian generals, it's still 2.1 million men and women globally deployed with the most advanced technology on the earth. And the officer corps and the NCO corps have been forged in combat. I mean, you talk to some 2-star division commander today, and that's all he's done his entire life is deploy and fight. They're really good at what they do. And by the way, that's 60,000 casualties. I went back once and talked to an unnamed national security advisor. He had a dozen people in his office and said we were medevacing 1,000 people a month into Landstuhl out of Iraq. And he thought I was making up the number. I said, oh, no, there's a real war going on out there. And by the way, 1,000 of those casualties were women, killed or wounded. So it's a pretty powerful force, and it's a tribute to the leaders that created it. Here's some quick assertions. Some of them are self-evident. The older I get, the more what I find I most believe in is sheer common sense. First assertion, one of the problems of the national security debate, I would argue, is that people don't seem to understand there's actually no guarantee that the U.S. will survive for another 25 years. It's actually a function of a lot of smart people thinking about national security in the broadest context, but we can lose our freedom, lose our economic viability. It's not just briefing points and white papers. You look back at history, we nearly lost the country in the Civil War. I was just down talking to the Civil War Trust at Gettysburg, incredible tour of the battlefield. Here there's 30 Civil War buffs. That was that close. 850,000 died. I mean, when you looked at the Battle of Gettysburg alone, the casualties were simply astronomical. Both sides essentially had in 3 days 20% of the force killed and wounded. If it come out the wrong way, if Lincoln hadn't been reelected, would we be a fragmented country in which part of it maintained slavery for another 80 years? Who knows? We nearly lost Europe in World War I. I'm on the World War I Centennial Commission advisory panel, Leon Panetta and I and Mike Mullen and a few others, trying to educate the American people about what happened in a fairly short period of time. The Allies were that close to losing on the last German offensive. On the last day of the war, and Ludendorff, by the way, told us 3 months after the war, he said, we quit because of the Americans. There's been inadequate historical recognition of that. The last day of the war, we had more American soldiers fighting in France than the French did, and we had 2 million more on the way. But it was a narrowly won thing. World War II, we lost a fleet, we lost an army. We shouldn't forget that. I was aide to a 2-star general, a wonderful man, taught in the social sciences department, Harvard graduate school, who was captured in Bataan. We lost the better part of our combat power in the Pacific. In Korea, we lost 2 divisions, gone, essentially. The 7th ID and the 2nd Infantry Division. My dad put the Advanced Corps CP into the Yalu, co-located him with the 7th ID. When he drove out, the Marines said, Colonel, you're not going to get through tonight. We think the Chinese have cut the road. And he was the last vehicle out. Most of them had frozen to death that night. But we were that close to losing our military power in North Korea. In Vietnam, we had 2 brigades that were defeated in the field tactically. And we had innumerable company-sized units and platoons that we lost. And at the end of the war, there's a wonderful book out on Lamson 719 by a professor out at Leavenworth, just powerful. Fortunately, it wasn't U.S. ground troops, but we lost the elite of the Vietnamese army, and if I remember, we lost almost 1,000 U.S. aviation helicopters. Occasionally I pound on the people serving in Iraq or Afghanistan. We've almost lost 3 U.S. companies in Afghanistan. And I say part of the problem is, it's something that I think you ought to take out of this assertion number 1 is, we've got to embrace fear. You got to recognize it doesn't actually have to come out the right way. By the way, I think that's part of the only criticism I'd have the current U.S. Armed Forces, the majors are the ones who are the danger. They actually think they can operate in platoon, squad-sized units. I remember a battalion commander boasting he had a platoon 10 hours drive from in Afghanistan. So we've got to consider that no magic hand is protecting the United States. Second assertion, the Larry Wilkerson phenomena. I suppose I shouldn't be using his name. Experienced Lieutenant Colonel Colin Powell's executive officer for 100 years, therefore experience in understanding diplomacy and military power. I was on some NBC news thing that turned into sort of a debate, and Colonel Wilkerson essentially says, well, he said, General, you don't understand that you and I are troglodytes, and that there's a new world now, and the real national offensive power of a nation is epitomized, and this is almost verbatim quote, by a pimply-faced teenage boy in a Moscow basement with a laptop computer and a half-drunk Pepsi. He'd obviously rehearsed this line several times. And that's what's going to defeat your carrier battle groups and your F-35s. You know, we had this wonderful general just passed away, Cavasso. Some of you may have known him. He's a magnificent human being. Captain Rifle Company commander in the Korean War, and he never forgot it. And, you know, what I responded to Wilkerson was, the 400,000 dead in Syria weren't killed by it. And by the way, I'm not diminishing the new forms of warfare, but they were killed by fighter bombers and artillery and light machine guns. And the invasion of Crimea, yeah, it had little green men, but it also had ADA and 152 artillery. Never mind the fighting in Mosul to take back the city, block by block, wasn't much different than the fighting in the Ruhr Pocket, the South China Sea. If we didn't have this powerful Navy, we would be in a different situation projecting global power. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards in the Straits of Hormuz, the Venezuelan people aren't being suppressed by nuanced, by the way, Putin's pretty nuanced in suppressing the Russian people, but mostly the Venezuelans are suffering and starving to death now because of direct, raw military force projected against them. The North Korean threat, lots of discussion, lots of you in the room know a lot about it. We are now probably 25% likely to end up in a shooting war with the North Koreans in the next 24 months. And by the way, they're a quasi-nuclear power. I don't think they can yet really employ ICBMs against us, but they will in the next 5 to 10 years. They have this giant military force, 34% of the population, male populations in the active or reserve forces. I personally think, by the way, we'll take them apart in under 6 months. Almost guaranteed. The first week of the war, their air power and their naval forces disappear. They've got 2 divisions, I think, that can actually fight. I think this nonsense about 11,000 artillery tubes. At the end of, in 2 weeks, I'll bet we get all the artillery directly threatening Seoul. But, you know, as Kim Jong-un starts to see his forces unraveling, the chances are he goes nuclear and goes after Guam, Okinawa, Hawaii. So what does somebody like me, if I'm the J5, do? I go in and tell the President of the United States, preemptive nuclear strike, 75 weapons to guarantee we don't have 3 million Americans killed. It's going to be actual military power that counts. Third assertion, economic power of the United States. I think I've got 2 slides in that packet, and I always like to put it out there. You know, you hear these astonishing statements about foreign powers. One of them that always amuses me is Russia. Russia has an economy 1/10 that of the United States, less than Italy, less than California. It's an impoverished place. The elevators still don't work. They don't have any serious strategic naval or air power to speak of. They are modernizing. They're a huge threat to their neighbors. The Baltic republics, Poland, Ukraine. Putin's very clever, very aggressive, running a kleptocracy. And he's less of a dictator than a thief, and a very clever one. They're on the ground with fairly light forces in Syria. You know, for God's sake, we got more people in the Middle East by far than they do. Now it comes to China. I put it 1.3 billion people, second biggest economy in the face of the earth. We still have the per capita income. The civilized democratic nations are still the wealthiest places in the world. But the tax bill, you know, by the way, I've got an advantage over some of you. I taught economics here. I got coached the night before by Jim Harding on what to say the next day. So I'm sure I don't understand how the economy works. And some of you do. But look, the tax bill, at some point arithmetic will count. The trade war, at some point a global economy, you can't disentangle from it. Unfunded social entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. You know, for God's sakes, it isn't the Department of Defense that's going to bankrupt the country, and nor is it hard to solve the problem of entitlement programs. I spent a lot of time on an engineering design firm board, and we asked these smart young engineers to solve multivariable problems all the time. Social Security's only got 3 variables. You get more money or less money. You pay more, you pay less, you get it earlier, you get it later. Come up with 3 answers, the big one, the middle one, and the small one. And then pick one and support it. We haven't done that. I think we ought to be worried about it. I think we ought to be worried about, one of the things that Trump has used adroitly, I think, is we ought to be worried about losing our manufacturing base. You know, at some point you can't be the global power if you don't make things. And we ought to be concerned about it. And by the way, right now we are the world's banker. You know, we can do all this because China's got to buy our debt and everyone else. What happens if that stops? Fourth assertion, a little bit difficult. I don't want to get too far on the wrong side of this issue. Ideas count. You know, in fact, you could almost argue the biggest reason we won so dramatically in the first Gulf War was air-land battle, combined with a lot of other things. So ideas do count. But you know, there's always extreme thinkers, particularly retired officers, who, you know, I remember we've had 2 Air Force 4-stars who were STRATCOM commanders who leave office and envision a world with no nuclear weapons. And I used to tell people, if we ever actually went to a nuclear-free environment, we've signed our death warrant. One of my favorite, I thought, mildly amusing things was, I'd always be impressed to go listen to Andy Marshall, Revolutionary Military Affairs. I said, you know, I was the assistant chairman, the J5s of the Army Strategic Planner. I said, I've been in a lot of meetings that started at 8 p.m. and went till 4 o'clock in the morning. I've never met Andy Marshall. And so the upshot of that, and I think I'm borrowing this more from Kissinger, if you want to influence ideas, you've got to be at West Point, Harvard Kennedy School, NDU, Army War College, Leavenworth, the Foreign Service Institute. You've got to get people when they're out of the operational force and invest in intellectual capital. And then the other part of that, by the way, it seems to me, is an awful lot of what we do in the Army is not education, it's training. And it's muscle movement repetition training. And you can have the most phenomenal force on the face of the earth, but if the mechanics can't keep the F-35 flying, or the sergeants don't know how to keep the M1 tank operational, it's all for naught. I had some idiot three-star once tell me in TRADOC, fairly few years ago, his son was going through the ADA basic course, and he persuaded Dad that the ADA course, basic course, ought to be on iPhones. Oh my God, you know. That's not an intellectual exercise. It's understanding how to operate ADA equipment, and that is training. Fifth observation. This comes directly from Colin Powell. Everybody likes white papers and strategic concepts, and the definition of a strategy is a conceptual architecture plus the budget that goes with it. So if you don't have the outlines of the money, you're wasting my time. These are CNN talking points. These are meetings that go on for 4 hours where nobody actually read the paper at stake. If you want to influence defense thinking, you have to affect the budget. And that budget needs to be a 15-year document. I mean, we can't do anything. I was the drug policy director, and I had a 5-year strategy, and I had some senators say, Barry, for God's sake, give us a break. Even the Soviets only had a 5-year plan. But you can't do anything significant in the armed forces today without a strategy and a budget. And if you're going to design a new piece of equipment and understand the maintenance and the training and the end-of-life cycle disposition, you have to be looking out there 15 years. We don't do that. You know, I've been in the Secretary of State's office when we changed our national objective because of a CNN story we were watching in his office. Just astonishing. My favorite story, and I don't think anybody in the room was with me, lift and strike the Balkans. Some brain-damaged person in the White House came up with lift and strike. And the way we're going to solve the Balkans problem was lift the arms embargo and bomb anyone that used them. And so in the Pentagon, we thought this was a rather stupid idea. And we argued against it vociferously, and this wonderful Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, was told by the administration, you got to go to Europe, you got to get these people aboard. So before we get on the plane, there's headlines in Europe, bunch of stupid guys coming to Europe to argue for a program that we're not going to do. And so we start off, the Brits are always civil to us, and we get in there, and we're at the Prime Minister Major's private country retreat with his cabinet there, and they're such gentlemen and ladies, and they were picking apart this idiocy in a very general way. And finally, Christopher says, well, he says, obviously my powers of persuasion are inadequate for the purpose, but fortunately we have a military genius, General McCaffrey here, who will explain all this to you. And I leapt to my feet and explained this appalling concept. Strategies, we need one. I just wrote a rather laudatory but critical article about Ambassador Bolton. You know, guy's brilliant, he's experienced, he knows everybody in the face of the earth and the international community. He's principled, he's got high energy, and he scares the hell out of a lot of us. The reason is, it seems to me, you're talking national security, we're defined by our allies. And the allies are with us not just because of our military power and economic power, but because of our values. You know, I've spent a lot of time in NATO, as have many of you. And I tell people, you look at the Brits and the French senior leadership and all the allies, and most of them are better spoken, better educated, more sophisticated people, and they all trust us because they think we're good organizers and we're honest. So I think we've got to be careful to not forget the allies as the centerpiece of our national security. Bullet number 7, don't ever forget about the power, the magnificent power of the U.S. Armed Forces. It is astonishing. You know, there's some slide in there that I love to put up there. I call it a bad news slide for democracy. You know, three co-equal branches of government. Who's the most important branch of government? Where I'm not going to do the normal Socratic thing I do with the Chamber of Commerce. It's the Congress, right? And the most important body is the House, and the most important person in the House is the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. You look at that, the degree to which the U.S. people trust the institutions of American government, dead last is Congress. Normally in the single digits, 9%, 8%. The media, the court system, religious leaders, most trusted institution in America, the armed forces, every year. Depends on how you answer the question and how high the number will be, but it's the most trusted institution. And the reason is, it seems to me, it actually, you know, when the sons and daughters of America write home, they tell mom, these petty officers and sergeants are people of courage and integrity, and they're developing me as a person, and we will stand between America's enemies and the civil population. Trust the American people. It's just an incredible institution. The more you're away from it, the more you can look back on it and recognize that. Assertion number 8. We are too bloated as a U.S. military structure. Oh my God. I don't know how it's like we have to throw all the chips back in a blanket and pick them all up again and start over. I commanded a division in the first Gulf War. My main CP, we put barbed wire around it so they couldn't escape, and I asked the chief to try and figure out how many people were there. There may have been 800 plus people in the main CP. I had to create an assault CP with 50 troops and some armored vehicles so I could get in the area of the action, along with a TAC CP. But I go into these Iraqi and Afghan brigade and division headquarters, and it looks like NORAD. And there's 200 people wearing blue blazers with rutabaga and suns on them that are maintaining the comm equipment, etc. And they can't move. And this works when it's area counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. And it works for a variety of reasons in some other situations. But if we fight the North Koreans, fight the Iranians, have to intervene in Cuba, have to intervene in Venezuela, have to go after nuclear weapons that are gotten loose somewhere, we actually need command and control that isn't that turgid. It's just outrageous. Divisions, the fighting at Monte Cassino, the German Parachute Corps is commanded by Lieutenant General Vienthoff. I remember he got his name right. He'd go up and recon the line with just his adjutant on foot. And the adjutant was told to stay 1,000 meters behind the general so he'd know if he'd been killed and could tell the next officer to take command. The Germans are commanding divisions with under 200 people. We got to look at being bloated. Here's a little bit of difficult one for me to speak in a balanced manner. We've changed our culture in 17 years of counterinsurgency warfare, counterterrorism warfare. A lot of stuff's changed. You know, we've got a military culture that now, when the JSOC just had a raid into Yemen, they had one Navy SEAL killed. They lost one tilt-rotor aircraft, and the country deemed it a disaster. That bodes ill for military operations going forward. Now, I don't believe I command a rifle company in combat in Vietnam. We still have reunions every couple of years. I remember telling some military history conference here, Suzanne, a bunch of civilian historians, that the casualty rates essentially at that level were 100% killed and wounded. You were getting clocked eventually, probably lightly wounded, tremendous medical care. But we can't go to the other extreme. When we use military power, people get hurt. And by the way, our soldiers are prepared to accept that. They absolutely are. We also have an investigation every time there's a shooting. Major from the adjoining battalion comes over and runs a 15-6. The first day of fighting the North Koreans, we're going to have problems. And by the way, I just gave a lecture to an unnamed World Affairs Council, and somebody, a very educated man, got up and he was very worried about the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, lethal strikes. He went on and he said, we're attacking people without legal authority. We don't have a warrant for their arrest. And he said, sometimes we don't even know their names. And I said, well, you know, I've tried to kill all sorts of people who I didn't know their names. I mean, just, it's an unrealistic expectation, but it's changed the culture. The worst two concepts, in my view, we ever came up with proportional force and exit strategy. It's causing problems. If you're going to use military power, you never know how it will come out, so you ought to avoid that. But if you finally do employ military power, it ought to be a condition-based outcome that you seek. 10th and final notion, we better rebuild our diplomatic power. For God's sakes, this wonderful Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, says, you know, if you won't fund the State Department, buy me more ammunition. Summarizes it just perfectly. We simply have to be able to engage. And by the way, when you look at government, most of you in the room know this, there's little pockets of excellence that are beyond belief. The Foreign Service, I would get a big cheer at NDU if I say that. The JCS staff, the National Security Council staff, we got to rebuild diplomatic power. They write beautifully, they have area knowledge, they speak the language, they have contacts, they have history in the region. They got some problems. I go in and out of Afghanistan. There were something like 1,000 people in the Kabul embassy. Many, and I'd be working some issue, and you know, the commander would give me a helicopter and 4 National Guard security guys, and I'd be off looking around. I'd go back and back brief the embassy staff guy responsible, and he'd never been out of the embassy. And the USAID guy had a brilliant man, PhD in political science. For God's sakes, the district engineer knows how to run construction projects. USAID's much smaller than it was during Vietnam. We have to build institutions that are adequate for the task, not just the State Department, I might add. State Department lacks a management capability. They can't organize 3 guys to run out of a telephone booth at the same time. If Colin Powell had stayed there for 10 years, he would have gotten the schooling to develop people to manage their important work. And finally, they can't keep a secret for more than an hour and a half. And if you know, the only way you get killed by Colin Powell was telling somebody in the State Department the mechanics of how one would carry out an operation. Because then the next time it'd be replayed at an NSC meeting. The compartmented programs where there might be 150 people in government that knew what we were doing, and I'd go over and hear it in the corridors of the State Department. And then I finally told Colin Powell, I said, I was going in there, I was his go to the NSC meetings guy, and I came back finally and said, you know, I think personally you ought to just wait until tomorrow morning and read the Washington Post. They write better than I do. And you'll get a better summary of the whole thing. Well, look, I'll tell you one thing. You've paid a lot more attention to me than my family does. You know, one of my favorite stories, I'm periodically on NBC News, and my substantive feedback loops come from my 2 grown daughters. They're both professional women. They're in their 40s, and you know, and so they'll call me on my cell phone and provide substantive feedback like, Dad, good makeup, good tie, good lighting, you know, that kind of feedback. So, true story, a couple years ago, Jack will appreciate this. We were down at 30 Rock. I'd been on 10 times. It was 8 o'clock at night. I stumble off air. My phone rings. My oldest daughter says, Dad, both of us girls are here in Yakima, Washington, the center of the universe, of course. And he said, that was a terrific interview. I said, well, that's great. I've been on all day. Which one was it? Dad, we don't know. We always turn the sound off. And on that note, that's all I know. Yeah, sure.
So General McCaffrey has agreed to take a few questions.
You should have ordered somebody to ask the first question. Yep, on the back.
Hey, sir. Good evening. Lee Robinson. Just a quick question. Has Mission Command made us more bloated or less bloated?
Well, you know, I'm actually a little worried about that. An unnamed Corps commander recently was walking me through, everybody's getting ready to fight in Korea. There's no orders coming from the top down, but everybody's getting ready to fight in Korea. And so there's a lot of, everybody's showing up there for briefings. The Corps commander says, you know, he said, I'm really disappointed in the Korean 4-star that I think I'm going to end up working for. And he said, we went over, they had a big conference, and he said the 4-star only talked for 15 minutes about his war plan. And he said, for God's sakes, my introductory slide packet is longer than that. Whoa. I do think it's part of its bloat, part of its electronics, part of its redundant oversight. Mission command isn't a bad concept, but I do worry about, I mean, the only reason that planning is useful at all is the process of working your way through it. One of the best tutorials I ever heard was from Dr. Bill Perry, one of the finest public servants in the history of this nation. What a remarkable man, little quiet, introvert, drafty, PhD from Stanford, scholar, businessman, and we had a shoot down. I don't know if you remember, there's a couple of Blackhawks got nailed by U.S. Air Force, I think F-15s, broad daylight, AWACS was up, open skies, no enemy air threat. You'd say, how in the hell could that happen? So he brought us in and we walked through the planning process. And he said, what you people essentially are doing is, you'll expend 10,000 hours of work to develop a plan, put it on the shelf, and never review it again for the next several years. We got too much, in my view, depth and granularity to the planning process. You know, at some point we have to go to mission type orders, you have to decentralize authority and resources, and we can do that in this military we've got now. I mean, the competence of battalion commanders, every time I go into Iraq or Afghanistan, I'd look at brigade commanders in particular, and almost every one I saw one bad one, and I think he was had mental health problems, and 10 visits over there. Most of the brigade commanders, you could have made them division commanders on the spot. Incredible, competent command and control. Too much bloat, too much planning, too much documentation, in my view. What other thoughts you got? Corey.
Anything useful that can be done in Syria right now to minimize what the Russians are gaining, to push, to foment the friction between Russia and Iran, and to do anything useful for the long-suffering people?
Well, last time I got asked that, I was on air and said, I don't have a clue, and nor am I accountable. And that's part of the problem. But I would say this. By the way, I'm astonished the armed forces, special ops, conventional forces, got into Syria, a couple of thousand, 4,000 or 5,000 contractors, very small footprint on the ground in Iraq, and we've actually rolled up ISIS almost entirely. It's astonishing performance. 10 years from now, we'll start getting good books on how that was done. But I see no way. First of all, Assad will never again be the legitimate governor of Syria, ever. Richard Haas has some good statements. Every time you see a straight line in the Middle East or almost anywhere, you've got a war going on. And so here's this tiny, 12% Shia population. Alawites are probably 2 or 3% of that. Some allies of the Druze and the Christians. They're a goner if the Sunni 75% of the country get their hands on them. So he's going to fight to the death. It's understandable what he's doing. They're not very effective. He didn't have any infantry left. That's why he's using poison gas warfare, Russian artillery, Russian tanks, Russian fighter bombers. So I don't think he's ever going to put the country back together. And then you look at you need a scorecard to understand who's fighting who. The Kurds, all of us love the Kurds. I mean, you want to live someplace safe, go up to Erbil and buy a ranch-style house in the suburbs. But they're fighting each other also. So the one thing I think is a glaring error in U.S. foreign policy is we haven't focused on the refugees. And it seemed to me the problem is the debate was over badgering Hillary Clinton about 100,000 and Trump says 10,000, and I say, first of all, you took 200,000 Syrians and dumped them into New York City tomorrow afternoon, we wouldn't know they were there. We got 16 million illegals wandering around this country. They get here, they can't believe their good fortune. They start opening laundries, their kids, the girls go to school, they're not afraid of the police. We can absorb huge numbers of refugees, but in this case, pick a number you believe, I think there's probably 8 million internal, external refugees. Huge numbers are clustered in Jordan and Turkey and some in Iraq. Why aren't we spending $1 billion a month, matched by $1 billion out of the European Union, to stabilize these poor people until finally people get sick of killing each other and they can go back to their homes? And we're not doing it. It's a real half-assed effort. No political will. I don't think we can solve, obviously, the Syria problem with the U.S. Armed Forces. And by the way, I think poor Mr. Putin's on the wrong side of the war. I don't think the Russians are going to benefit out of all this. After the last 5 years, Russia's gone to a beleaguered nation. Economic constraints are having a huge impact on them. There are all these threats back and forth. The Russian General Staff said if the Americans attack anywhere we are, we'll not only shoot down their missiles, we'll attack the carriers. And so, I got a good feel for U.S. air power and naval power. That would be a huge mistake in the Middle East to take on U.S. Armed Forces. So I don't know what the solution is. But we need a bigger humanitarian, State Department-led, USAID, multinational effort to stabilize the refugees. Yes, ma'am.
Importance of allies, and that they're with us because of our values. Turkey's an important ally that has become an increasingly challenged relationship because I think they're kind of departing from the values of a democratic nation. So what are we to do? I mean, there are strong arguments to keep it together, especially when we look at Turkey as a southern part of NATO. But there are also arguments about maybe distancing ourselves. So curious to get your thoughts on Turkey.
Would you clearly state the question now, Raven?
Earlier you mentioned the importance of allies.
Right.
The relationship with Turkey is increasingly challenged.
Yeah.
The earlier part with values.
So mostly focused on Turkey?
Yes.
It's, what are we going to do? The thing's sliding the wrong way. Democracy's in disrepair. I mean, when I was a cadet taking Latin American studies, I remember there were two democracies in all of Latin America, Costa Rica and Uruguay. And then by the time I was the joint commander, they were all but two were democratic nations. And now they're going the other way. And democracy, if it doesn't deliver the goods, that means justice and effectiveness, then people look for a strong man. So, and by the way, one way to explain yourself as a strong man is use religion. I mean, Mr. Putin now is some kind of Orthodox Christian with crosses and holy water, etc. It's astonishing. Erdogan is in power. The coup was badly done. He's massacred or imprisoned all the internal forces that could oppose him. Last time I was in Turkey, my guide was a very educated woman, master's degree from a Western European school. The educated people are appalled, but I think he's got the armed forces and the internal police under control. They're gone. The only thing good about it is they are Sunni Muslim. They are traditional enemies of the Russians. So it's hard to imagine. They'll never be a member of the European Union anymore. I mean, I think that's gone for the foreseeable future. But some of these problems can't be solved. They can be mitigated. They can be, we can take a balanced approach. I must admit I'm embarrassed and uneasy about the current administration's identification with authoritarian governments. I mean, some of them are just ridiculous. Poor Mr. Duarte in the Philippines, a murderous thug. So that needs to be visible in our foreign policy and in our engagement. We ought to speak, privately when we're threatening people, but publicly we ought to defend our values. I don't think we're doing that adequately today. Yes, sir.
going so well. Sexual assault and harassment, very little improvement. What are your recommendations?
You know, first of all, there's some good news here. Look, you know, the armed forces are still the leading institution in the United States on seeking merit-based organizations, rule of law, internal respect. You know, I've got bunches of those of you in the room who are women and in the armed forces, and one of them I remember asking, I said, God, have you got a third of your unit being sexually assaulted? She said, no, but I probably have a third of my unit that have had sexual contacts that they regret. And I talk to the division commanders about this all the time. And my impression is we got healthy changing objectives and standards. And, but, you know, one of the division commanders told me, he said, look, 2/3 of my soldiers live off post. He said, you know, everything goes well during the week. On the weekend, we have parties. Everyone gets drunk until they're throwing up on their shoes. They have sex. Monday, the stories start spreading. Tuesday, somebody goes to the commander. We start the investigation. And by the way, a lot of the military now are married, and they're deployed all the time overseas. So I think that's adding to the social tension. But I'm very proud of what the Army's done as a general statement. You know, the turning point on women in the armed forces was clearly Desert Storm. And up until then, we had these artificial ways of dealing with a fairly small number of women in the armed forces. Desert Storm, I had 1,000 women in my division. I told people at the end of the war, if I'd asked the platoon sergeants and the company commanders, we're going to run the same operation again, I'll give you a high caliber male soldier and take your females, not a one of them would have bought into it. So, you know, practically speaking, if you talk to a battalion or brigade commander, they say, no, the Army's a hell of a lot more powerful because of women included in the ranks. And they're out there fighting and flying FA-18s off carriers. And West Point now, 25% of the incoming class going to be women. I think we got some issues, but I must admit, I don't know. I want to see women empowered, though. We're not going to eliminate sex in the workplace, by the way. Not at all. Nor am I particularly interested in trying that. I think what we do want, certainly when I said as a division commander, if you're a squad leader, a platoon leader, company commander, battalion commander, you're in charge. If you don't have a dignified, safe environment, I'm going to have your ass. And that includes the women commanders, obviously. So I still think, you know, comparatively, the armed forces are a place where there is, by and large, respect and law-based behavior and competence. And the women West Pointers, holy crow, they're sort of a different group of creatures raised in this environment. And when you see them in tactical units, they've just been magnificent. So I don't know. I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I think we're reporting a lot more than we probably should. I don't want to see criminal justice used to adjudicate teenage behavior. I want people to have their buns kicked by the first sergeant or somebody and coached back in the line. What other thought you got? Yes, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Jim Jeffrey. First of all, thanks for the call out to the Foreign Service. We really appreciate it. But let me go back to my career before the Foreign Service. And some of us, besides you and me, I go back that the Army of the 60s and 70s. You talked correctly from my pretty close exposure to what a combat experienced Army we have today. But just like the Army of the 70s, is it combat experience for the right kind of law? Thank you.
Well, maybe not. You know, one of the problems I think we've got in the military, and I borrow this from people who include Colin Powell. And I tell people we don't need any help from the civilian leadership of the armed forces or the White House to run combat operations anywhere in the face of the earth. What we do need help is people like Bill Perry, people like Bob Gates, to look out 15 years and see where national security threats will be, what's the technology, what's affordable in the economy, and to craft these larger visions. That's the job of the civilian leadership. And I remember being, you know, semi-hostile coaching from U.S. Ambassador to NATO once. I had a one-star over there, and he said, you know, Barry, he said, oh, this all gets turned upside down. He said, all you military guys got a second-rate graduate degree, and you want to talk about political science objectives in Europe. And what we don't know about is how to get Pershing missile systems out of Europe. And so we'll say, why don't you just cut them down a missile a day in each battery, and you got to tell us the mechanics of it, how things could be made to work. I don't know. I think we have some education problems to some extent. That's our really good. Remember, Kissinger said, when you're in government, you can't build intellectual capital, you expend it. These schooling systems of ours are vitally important. That's why I fear when I see us cutting back from one-year courses where the spouse goes with you and where you hang around afterwards and educate each other, and where we get the foreign service people at NDU level and Harvard integrated with us. I don't know if I adequately responded to your question, but yeah, okay. May have stunned everybody into silence. So Heidi, what about you? You're the poll ad, for God's sake, right?
Sir, I actually wonder if I could ask you,
Okay.
given that this is the population that we have on our faculty, you had mentioned at one point that the captains and majors are the problem. I wonder if you could, the current captains and majors are the problem in terms of understanding Army operations.
Well, let me rephrase that. Normally I use the majors, not the captains, because I'll say as a major in the Army is somebody that was an incredibly successful captain, commanded a company battery detachment, was good at what he did. They've been at it now. Some of them have 2, 3, 4 combat deployments. A Ranger regiment's gone, 6 out, 6 back. So they're really good at what they did. And in a flash of an eye, the major's a major general. And if we don't have a good schooling system, they'll take into the senior leadership roles the lessons they learned on the battlefield in Vietnam or Korea or Afghanistan, and they'll be unprepared to deal with a North Korean high-intensity air-land sea warfare. I think that's more what I'd say. I mean, you look at the majors, and if I have to do Founders Day speeches, by the way, and I got this from one of the superintendents, if you're a stand-in on Founders Day dinner speech, he said, Barry said, if you go out there and you try and give them substance, they'll kill you. So he said, just stick with inspiration. And so normally if I'm talking about West Point, I'll say, well, I don't know a whole bunch about what's going on up there, but I do know about who the cadets are, and I know who the majors on the faculty are like. And so we just don't have a problem at West Point. That's really my concern. So look, good luck to all of you. Enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Sir, I just, on behalf of Senior Conference 54 and the assembled gathering, I just want to thank you so much for getting our conference off to the right foot. As a token of our appreciation, hopefully most of the memories are good, but we'd like to present you with a picture of the Department of Social Sciences in the year 1973. Hopefully you remember your class. Thank you so much.
That was a terrific gift. Thank you.
And Heidi, did you?
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Heidi Demarest. We're just delighted that everybody made it here safely. It's wonderful to see so many old friends, and because I know so many of you in the room, I also know that standing between you and the bar is a very dangerous place to be. So I'll be very brief here for some administrative details for tomorrow morning. We're off to an early start, so the buses are going to leave the hotel at 8 a.m. 8 a.m. They're going to be right outside the main lobby door, and they're going to take you to Jefferson Hall, which is where we're going to spend most of the day tomorrow. When you arrive at Jefferson Hall, there will be a heart-healthy breakfast, which is just like it sounds. So if you need bacon in the morning to get going, you may want to go to the hotel buffet, which opens at 7 o'clock in the morning. Please bring your lanyards with your name on them and your registration booklet. It has some helpful information in it. And then tomorrow afternoon, the buses will bring you back here before the reception and the dinner. If you have any problems at any time,
please direct them to Major Liz Berardo. Or any members of the conference staff. We're in your, it's good practice for the XO job. We're in your registration booklets, and we're here to make things run more smoothly. And with that, we'll adjourn so you can continue your dinner conversations. 8 a.m. Thank you.